welcome, dear friends, to this sixth session of the 2022 Turner Winter Series, now in its 17th year and now being held in the spacious comfort of the Robert H. Jackson Center here in Jamestown. I'm Maureen Raveno. Whether you are here in person, watching through live streaming, or if you are joining us later via YouTube, it is my great pleasure to begin our time together with a brief introduction of our special guest, a delightful and important new addition to our community who will engage in conversation with our perennial host and the founder of this series, Jamestown's and the Jackson Center's own Greg Peterson. So let me first say a few words to begin to get to know and appreciate our special guest. Amit Taneja serves as the inaugural Senior Vice President and Chief Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, IDEA, Officer at Chautauqua Institution. He's come to provide leadership on institutional priorities for all of these ideals, including the creation of the IDEA strategic plan and its implementation, and to engage with all aspects of the Chautauqua Institution community, as well as with the larger regional community. Especially passionate about engaged dialogue, and as a new member of the Chautauqua County region, he has committed to being an active member of our larger community, having begun by attending the Chautauqua County IDEA Coalition meetings even before he had moved to the county. He is now pleased to serve on the steering committee for this coalition in helping to make the county more welcoming and more inclusive to all. Amit previously served as the Associate Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the College of the Holy Cross and as the Chief Diversity Officer at Hamilton College. He has 2 decades of experience working broadly in IDEA work within higher education. A first-generation college graduate, he completed a bachelor's degree in psychology at the University of British Columbia and a master's degree in college student personnel from Bowling Green State University, and he has ABD, all but dissertation status, in the higher education doctoral program at Syracuse University. His scholarly research focuses on LGBTQ students of color in higher education. In daily life, Amit and his husband, Christopher, now live in Asheville with their 2 feline overlords, Calvin and Hobbs. And so, with this excellent background, it is now my great pleasure to welcome my Chautauqua Institution colleague and dear friend, Amit Taneja, in conversation with our host and also my dear friend, Greg Peterson.
Thank you, Maureen, and tell me about your bow tie.
That's a great way to start. So most of my life I've worked where I'm exercising my brain a whole lot, doing a lot of problem solving, a lot of thinking, and what I found was I would try to go to bed and my brain was still thinking about a problem, about a meeting I had to have. So I decided I needed to do something with my hands to kind of disrupt that, sort of cycle of thoughts. And so I tried a couple of things, and it was too easy to go back to the thoughts, but I'd never sewn before. And I love bow ties. I've been wearing bow ties long before they were fashionable. So you can say I'm a trendsetter. And so I decided one year, about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I asked for a sewing machine for my birthday. Because there's something about a sharp needle, right, coming towards your finger really makes you focus. So I got into the practice of making my own bow ties, and it's been just, a fun little project to do on the side.
So, how do you design it? Hopefully somebody can see that on the film. It's really quite remarkable. It goes well with the everything that you have on. Do you design it yourself? Design all the other stuff?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's actually become a hobby of mine. Like, I don't want to make bow ties that you can buy at any store. So anytime we go traveling, unfortunately, one of the things I do is find if there's a fabric store, right? So we were in Amsterdam, and I was like, found a fabric store, got to find some unique fabric. So everything I make is, custom. It's different than anything else you can buy in the store.
Let me tell you right now, there is no Jamestown Tarp Skunks bow tie. I just want you to know there's none. So if you want to do something really unique and impress certainly your interviewer, that might be it. I'm not saying you do that, but that's just a thought.
Making a mental note.
Okay, good deal. And I mean, gardening, flying kites, I mean, is this all childhood revisited?
A little bit, not the gardening part. So I grew up in India and not a lot of people and a very small amount of land. So all gardening for the most part happens in pots. We had a little bit of a garden, but that wasn't part of my growing up. The kites was. So if anybody's read The Kite Runner, the whole idea of kite as sport, that was my thing. So I'd come home and I wanted to get up onto the roof. Roofs in India are flat. So that's where you go to fly your kite. And my parents would say, nope, you got to finish your homework. So I got really good at finishing homework quickly. And that meant, whatever time I had left in the evening was spent up on the roof, flying kites. And there was just something so much fun about it. It really is a sport, right? So you fly kites, you cut other people's kites off, you try to get into friendly competitions and sometimes not so friendly competitions. So that was a fun part of growing up. So even now when I travel, I have a favorite kite that has traveled to about 40 different cities. So I've flown it in a mountain in Spain and on the beaches of Florida. It's one of the things I still do. It just gives me great joy.
So does it give you great joy to cut somebody off and to really kind of bully them while doing a kite?
Well, culturally speaking, it's a whole sport, right? And there is actually some norms around it, right? So you take your kite next to somebody. If they withdraw, that means, hey, I'm not interested in a competition. But, there's certain gestures you can do by pointing your kite towards somebody else to say, let's go, right?
Really?
So there's some etiquette around it. Not everybody follows it, but that was the fun part of, figuring out who was at the same competition level as you. And, yeah.
Wow, this is a whole different world.
Yeah.
Kite competition. What does that really mean? I mean, most people who are just standard, like myself, how high can you go and make sure it doesn't
Sure.
crash into a tree? But I assume that it's the whole design and everything else?
Absolutely, yeah. So the kites that I grew up with were made out of almost like crepe paper. They're very thin. They're made with bamboo sticks. So they're not really meant to last for weeks. Sometimes you might have a kite for 10 minutes and somebody cuts it off, then, somebody else will catch it. It lands somebody, so you get to keep the kites that land on your roof. Or if
So possession is everything.
possession is everything, yeah. And you can't go back and claim and say that was my kite. We'd sometimes buy kites. I was a small little kid. I would buy kites about, 4 feet wide. And sometimes you would fly them so far out in competition. Once you engage in a competition, you keep giving string until one of the strings gives. So sometimes a kite this big would turn into a little speck in the sky.
Wow.
That you couldn't even see it at times. So that was a real fun thing to do.
How do you declare victory when you're you've engaged? I mean,
Yeah.
you're there and you tease them, and it's sort of like in the wild. There's a couple of lions looking at each other, and then all of a sudden they decide to engage. Is that how this happens?
Yeah, I mean, you get into the competition and you wait for that moment. So when you're in competition, the weight of the other kite is on your kite too. So your hand is really straining at that time. And then all of a sudden you feel that magical moment when your kite just gets light and either you've lost or the other person's lost. And you figured that out in a second. And when you did, everybody had their victory call, and mine was something like a bruja or something like that.
Bruja?
But you just yell out loud in joy. And then my parents would say, keep it down, what would the neighbors say?
So they would hear that sound,
Yeah.
and that's your victory call.
That was my victory call.
Do you do this? It's the kind of thing you would call if you needed an extra beer at Southern Tier Brewing.
I haven't tried that, maybe next time I go.
Yeah, bruja.
Bruja.
Yeah, I love it. That's fascinating. And was there actual competitions where you would go and to some city and say, all right, here's the field, and to the victor the spoils?
Yes, there were particular high holidays. So there's a particular celebration that happens at the end of the harvest period, and that's a weekend where the sky is just filled with kites all over. And you can go to organized kite competitions and stuff like that. I just mostly did it from my rooftop because there was no shortage of other kids around me, engaging in that as a sport.
So aside from your parents telling you to keep it down, what did they do for a living?
So my dad had a series of businesses, but he mostly, he worked in leather for a while, and then he moved towards the printing industry. So he made a very specific part, rubber rollers, which are used to basically the device that picks up the ink and transfers it to the paper. So he was a specialist in that. My mom, for the most part, early part was, her primary work was taking care of my sisters and I, but when we migrated to Canada, then she had a few jobs working at a furniture store was probably the longest thing. My entire family is mostly introverts, and my mom is an extreme extrovert. She will go up to any stranger and strike up a friendly conversation, and they won't even know sort of what's happening, right? She's just got that ease around her, so she really enjoyed being in that furniture sales business and did really well there for a bit.
Then at some point, was there an aha moment where you decided that you would go from one former British colony to another in Canada?
That's a good question. Yeah, it was a move that came over a number of years. So the Canadian government was looking for people who could come and set up businesses that would either reduce their reliance on imports or create Canadian jobs. So my dad was a specialist, as I said, in this line of work, and for the most part, most of the rubber rollers for Canadian presses were coming from the United States, so which meant, when the dollar fluctuated, the Canadian businesses would be hit quite badly, because some of these devices need to be replaced on a monthly basis, right? So you're talking about large quantities and volumes, so he made a very thoughtful business plan saying, hey, I can only employ maybe 2 Canadians, but this is how it impacts your economy, right? So he kind of came over on a business visa originally. But that whole process, took over 5 years. At the same time, I had the opportunity to, I had a scholarship from Singapore Airlines to go study engineering in Singapore, and I've always been good at math and sciences. I even represented India in some computer programming competitions in high school. Yeah, I'm not only good looking, I'm also very smart and humble. But, so the challenge for me was, do I take the opportunity to go to Singapore and become an engineer? And they had a guaranteed job with a very decent salary at that time that you had to commit to for 4 years. So all your education was free. So there was that, but if I did that, then I would not be able to be Canadian. So that was part of the mix. My family was moving. I was still barely a minor. I was coming under my dad's immigration, so we decided to go to Canada instead.
And you went to British Columbia?
Yeah, so actually, that's not true. We landed in Montreal. This is actually a fun story. So I was supposed to come with my entire family. I was 18 years old, and a bubonic plague of some sort broke out in Western India, and there was within a week, there was news stories about other countries talking about shutting down airports and seaports. And our immigration attorney called my dad and said, if Amit turns 19 in India, he will no longer be a minor. So you got to get him on a plane like tomorrow, which is what we did. So my dad came. We landed in Montreal. It was a balmy, 34 degrees. We had never experienced cold like that. And my dad looked at me, I looked at him, he said, maybe we should try Vancouver. So 3 days later, we were in Vancouver. But the original plan was Montreal, and the weather was too much for us there.
What time period was this?
This would have been mid-90s, so 95, October, November, something like that.
Was this Pierre Trudeau time?
No. I honestly can't remember now. It's been a while.
But anyways, that was Quebec,
Yeah, it was the time when Quebec, the Quebec separation movement,
Yeah, yeah.
independence movement was pretty strong. So I was there when they did some of the, that was something really fascinating, right? So I grew up in India where like, mostly grew up in Punjab, which is the Sikh state. And there was a whole movement for Punjab to secede from India and be its own independent country. So I mostly grew up not looking Sikh, even though I follow part Hindu and part Sikh traditions, is how I grew up. Most of that time was spent under the threat of violence, of civil war, that kind of stuff. And then I come to Canada, and there is a vote on whether the part of the country can secede. And that just whole concept for me, I'm like, so people don't fight in the streets to secede? Like you actually vote on something like that? It was kind of mind-blowing in its own way.
So did you, when you went to British Columbia, as to especially the school there, those were questions you had to ask? I mean, like, help me with the culture, essentially.
Yeah, what was interesting was that I had landed in Canada, right? I had been living there for a few months, and then I start college. And on paper, I was a legal permanent resident. In practice, my experience probably was much closer to that of international students because I was still learning customs, slang, understanding how things like banking works, just day-to-day concepts that people won't even, wouldn't consider. So this idea that you can swipe a transit card and there's nobody there other than you just using your honor to swipe the transit card, that would not fly in most countries because people would just jump over the turnstile all over the place, right? So there's all these moments of like shock, right, in some level, learning all those cultural practices. So at some level, there was a lot of learning that I had to do in order to prepare. So I lived in Canada for 6 months by myself, and then my rest of my family came, and I did everything. I rented an apartment and did everything to set up the apartment for my family to arrive, right? So when you migrate, it's the same as traveling. You get 2 suitcases. So I bought beds and mattresses and plates and forks and all that kind of stuff to set up the basics for an apartment. In a number of ways, I ended up being the cultural translator for my family as well, right? Helping them understand this is how things work here.
So you had explained to them probably hockey and hockey slang, and cricket isn't played there?
Sure, yeah. It took a while for me to actually even catch on to some of those things. And my classmates had fun with me. I remember going to one of my first hockey games at my undergraduate institution, University of British Columbia, and they were like explaining the rules to me, and they said, and when the puck goes in the goal, you yell touchdown, which is what I did, right, to everybody's
Oh, man.
amusement. Yeah, they were fun guys, so they were having fun with me.
They did teach you how to drink Labatt's and Molson and things like that?
Yes, I actually have a...
And you don't have to, by the way, you don't have to admit anything if I ask a question, but it's okay.
No, proud to be Canadian, so, I did once, actually, I was legal age, because legal drinking age in Canada is 19. So, yes, Canadian was my go-to beer. I have a fun story with that. So, partway through college, there was a big push to make campuses more cognizant about promoting responsible drinking. So Labatt was doing this whole, Labatt is the big competitor for Molson.
Right.
And so they were doing these, hiring folks on campuses to do this responsible drinking coordinator. So you do like comedy nights and do all kinds of programming and just send the idea that you can drink, but you don't have to do it, but to do it responsibly. So I did this job for about a year and a half, and then I got invited to a meeting of all of these reps in Toronto and had a great day and a half there, and we go out for dinner, and we sit down, and the waiter comes and said, "What would you like to drink?" And I said, a Molson Canadian, please, which I was not thinking. I was not thinking I'm here in the company of Labatt people, and the person who had hired me, she was sitting right next to me, and she had a whole meltdown. How dare you insult us like this? So I had to switch to Labatt. I am pragmatic.
And responsible, clearly.
Yes,
Clearly.
absolutely.
So, how long then were you in British Columbia? At some point, you come across the border.
Yeah, so I did 6, 7 years in Canada. I did my first 2 years of undergraduate education in engineering, because that's what I knew, that's what I was good at. Unfortunately, I was very, very bored, because the math that I was learning in first and second year engineering was the math I learned in grade 7 or grade 8 in India. It's that different. So in a number of ways I was coasting, but then no disrespect to any engineers out there, but every engineer I met, and they would come, and talk to us about what they do on a daily basis, it just became clear to me over time that that's not what I was called to do. You can be good at something, but not have that be your calling. So I switched into psychology, and then it became clear to me that, my larger calling in life was to help open doors for people who have been historically marginalized. And one of the ways I thought that I could do that is through higher education, because I think education in itself really can help open doors for many people, as it did for me. So then I realized that most of the graduate programs that prepare you to work in administration in colleges and universities were in the States. So I applied to a few, got accepted to all of the ones that I applied to, and then my heart really was drawn to the program at Bowling Green State University. So that's how I came to the States, with the intention of coming for 2 years and finishing my program and going back to Canada.
This is Bowling Green, Ohio?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, Bowling Green.
You just talked quite a bit of an arc from engineering to psychology to then helping those that are marginalized. Help me through some of the process, mental
yeah.
processes to get there.
Yeah. So, so you have to, picture my circumstances. I'm in my 4th semester in my engineering program. I had 3 semesters of straight A's, top 5%, Dean's List. I'm hardworking. I mean, it wasn't just that, I knew the math and stuff. I was good at doing my schoolwork, but, recent immigrant family, right? So we didn't have a lot of money. Lots of transition issues. My siblings, struggling with fitting into Canadian life. I had 4 jobs because, trying to help family keep the lights on, literally keep the lights on. And over time, the stress just got to me, right? And sorry, one more important piece. And in that time period, I also came out as a gay man, and was hoping that I was going to find a community that was going to embrace me, but really didn't find that. I found a lot of exclusionary sentiments around race, or more even so around class, like, the clothing I wore, or, things like that. So I kind of had a really rough semester. My 4th semester, I went from straight A's to straight F's. There wasn't even a B or C in my fall from grace. So I got a letter saying, hey, you're getting kicked out. So I went to the dean, and I told him my sob story, and I said, here's the things where I went wrong. I've given you 3 semesters of evidence that I'm a good student, that I'm hardworking, and here is my plan of how I'm going to put my life back together. If you kick me out, I don't have housing, I don't have access to counseling, I don't have access to career counseling, I don't have tuition dollars. Give me a chance to stay here. And in those days, or maybe it was just that dean, he said, Amit, in engineering, either you make it or you don't, and you didn't. And so he still kicked me out. And I remember having this very, like a pivotal moment that just gets burnt in your memory. I have that very visceral memory of that interaction. I remember walking out of there saying, people like you should not be dean. Right? And so then I thought, well, then who should be a dean? Who can understand the challenges that historically marginalized students face, right? So I was dealing with much bigger life issues, so it's not about my intellect, it's not about my ability to work hard, but I just had a lot going on, and I needed somebody to take a chance on me after I had proven myself. So that kind of set me on the path to actually want to be a college president and to be a dean, and then I wanted to be a college president. That was before I figured out what college presidents do, and there's not enough money in the world for me to want to do that now. So that was the moment that kind of led me into psychology and towards college administration.
So then you ultimately work your way, you're in Ohio, Bowling Green, Ohio, outside of Toledo. Was there an aha moment where you're saying, I've arrived, this is the follow the yellow brick road, I found it?
Yeah, I mean, I had a very clear vision of what I wanted to study and then what I wanted to do with that degree, right? So every degree prepares you, gives you some skills. So from day one when I showed up, I wanted to understand how historically marginalized students have been excluded out of higher education, but more importantly, I wanted to tell the stories of those who were able to make it through, right? So it wasn't a simple, either you're out, you're in. There's not a lot of people who had written about the skills, the tactics that people use to be successful in higher education. So that was my life calling and purpose. And at every step, I think I was able to figure out a way to do that and to do it better, right? As I advanced in my doctoral program, I did that. So there wasn't a one aha moment, but it was a series of aha moments that gave me greater and greater insight into the policies and practices that either create support or create exclusion.
So, but at one point you go from a student learning to a student researching in certain areas to all of a sudden a position where you're now teaching and guiding. Are those skill sets that you just have innate, or is that something you really got to develop?
I think it came over a period of time, but part of it is, again, right, like if you figured out what your calling in life is, then you figure out some ways to get around the barriers. So I can tell you, like on many different jobs, right, no matter what job I had, I was always keeping that lens of how is my office serving all students? And if I can figure out a way to serve the most marginalized students, then I'm guaranteed that everybody else can also be successful here, right? So I had to do a lot of pushing, a lot of skill development, and I've always been a little bit of a go-getter, right? So I wasn't afraid in my first year working at Syracuse. So after my master's program, I went to work at Syracuse University, and I'm a relatively low-level employee in residence life, and I just called the vice president's office and I said, I'd love to hear what you do. Can we go out for lunch? I basically made him take me out for lunch. He was paying for lunch. But it kind of struck him, like he said, this is rare. Mostly people in your position never think to call on me, so thank you for doing that. And that led to a wonderful mentorship that I still, maintain to this day. So it was some of those moments, I think, that kind of helped me move from student to teacher and role model, maybe.
Was that an opportunity in certainly schools, colleges that some of the bigger ones you've been at, which have a reputation for being more liberal arts, liberal arts, that permitted the areas which would enhance your type of programming, which is assisting them, I don't want to use the term marginalization, but there's that concept? I mean, this is kind of the early 2000s. I mean,
yeah. I mean, even for the colleges that I've worked at, there are selective liberal arts colleges, but that doesn't mean that conservative voices are not valued there. And I would say that more historical the institution, the deeper the roots of tradition worked, right? So it was sometimes even harder to disentangle policies or practices that would keep students from being successful. So let me give you just a random example. At one of the institutions I worked at, students were guaranteed financial aid, right? So if your family could only afford $1,000 and it cost $50,000 to go there, the college was going to give you $49,000. Some of the low-income students, I mean, they were like amazingly brilliant, right? And so they won a $5,000 scholarship, right? Now you would think that's $5,000 that's going to them. But the practice was $1,000 your family gives, the college gives you $44,000, and the $5,000 that you won goes right back to the college, right? It didn't go to the students. So it took some like sort of, more reflective thinking to say, I know that we've done it this way all the times. But for students who are not on financial aid, we literally write them a $5,000 check, right? So what is the message then we send that say, you did the work, but you do not get to reap the benefit of it? So it was being able to highlight those kinds of discrepancies, maybe, would be one way to say it, to that even for a liberal institution, it takes so long for them to say, oh yeah, like this doesn't feel parity, doesn't feel equity in practice.
So you're working quite a bit in academia,
Yeah.
and at some point, you launch away from that into something different. What was that decision? I mean, it's sort of comfortable to be in academia.
Yeah. I got into higher ed because I really wanted to be present with the students, and I loved doing that work. And then over time, I wanted to be a college president, but the modern college presidency is, as may be the case for many institutions, it's mostly on-the-road fundraising, right? And which is important, right? I'm not arguing against it, but that's not what my calling is. It's not what I wanted to do. So I ended up becoming a dean. I ended up doing a lot of work with faculty, and all that work was rewarding. But I really missed that human connection with students. I wasn't getting as much. I had to really work hard to make time in my schedule to be present for students. And so over time I felt, you know what, maybe I just need to take my skills and talent, like try a new adventure as well. It's really hard work, and particularly during the pandemic, working 12, 14 hours a day. There were 11 people who had write access to my calendar, which meant I had no control over my calendar. And over time, I just was looking for a new adventure. So I ended up being sort of on the board of a nonprofit organization in Worcester, where I was right before here, at a botanical garden nonprofit. And that's where I realized that my skill set was so transferable to the nonprofit world that it just kind of opened my eyes to say, why have I been discounting this as a place to bring my gifts and talents to? So that kind of opened the door to look at a couple of nonprofits.
So one of the nonprofits and is Chautauqua Institution.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yep.
where you currently are, and you have a Chautauqua Institution Senior Vice President and Chief IDEA Officer. What came first, the chicken or the egg? Did Chautauqua create this position and saw you, or did you kind of reach out and say, hey, I got an idea? No pun intended.
Sure. Well, it's Chautauqua created the position, but let me tell you a little bit of the story behind that. So my in-laws who are in the audience, thank you for coming, are here. And so we had visited Chautauqua County a number of times, but also Chautauqua Institution. We'd been on the ground, seen lectures, seen performances, and every time we went there, I had this magical feeling about this is an amazing place, right? It's kind of like a college for people of all ages. It's a place to nourish your mind, body, and soul. Like who wouldn't enjoy that, right? So I've long held Chautauqua in deep regard. And so in terms of the position being created, when Michael Hill, our current president, came to the institution grounds, it was timed well because we were launching the plan for the next phase of Chautauqua. So there were a number of listening sessions that happened around Chautauqua grounds to create the 150 Forward strategic plan for the institution. And one of the things that came out loud and clear from that plan was Chautauquans saying, we need to really think about the diversity of our audience, of our staff, of the people that make up the entire Chautauqua community. And that was a call that I know was taken up by the board, by the staff, and the larger community, and people made very passionate arguments for why we needed to move in that direction. So out of that strategic plan came this idea that we are going to have some very focused inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility goals, and in order to shepherd that work, they thought it was important to have somebody with experience come and do that. So that's how my position was created. There was a big national search, national pool of applicants, and I think they made the right decision, I hope. But here I am.
Well, given what you've disclosed of your deep, dark secret goal is to be president, does Michael Hill know this?
No, that was to be a college president, right?
Ah.
And I would probably joking.
He's watching.
I'm sure he is. Hi, Michael. He is an incredible leader, and he has the energy of 15 people, and I am very happy where I am right now.
When the listening was occurring, when they asked for input, and I think as a local, as a native of Chautauqua County, Chautauqua Institution has been perceived, and probably with some justification, as exclusive. It's got a gate. You have to pay to get in, and there weren't many people of color. I mean, I think, and that's kind of was a perception. And to get to that point where that is, perception becomes less real, I suspect that's one of the motivating factors of that session, which led to a strategic plan.
Yeah, I mean, there was different parts of that story, right? So it was more Chautauquans, and particularly generational Chautauquans, saying that, hey, when my kids come here, they're saying that this place just feels very different from their experience living in big cities, right? They don't see very many diverse communities surrounding them, and there is, I think, a palpable and genuine fear, particularly on the part of generational Chautauquans, that the next generation might not connect if Chautauqua doesn't change with the world around us is changing, right? So the challenge then is how do we turn our gates into gateways? That's a phrase that Michael uses that I absolutely think is the right way to think about it, right? How do we invite communities that will not only come and enrich the Chautauqua experience by their presence, but is also a wonderful experience for them as well, right? So it's a two-way street. It's not an act of charity of inviting people because we just want to have an X percentage of folks. But if we are representative of the larger society, then we need to figure out a way to invite those diverse communities to the grounds and to make them feel welcome and included and appreciated.
So you not only are seeking well, maybe it's a question, diversity in the sense of backgrounds, but is there also a sense as part of this program, diversity of thought?
Sure. I mean, I think we actually do part of that already. Yeah. I want to push, back at the idea. Sometimes people say, oh, Chautauqua was way too liberal. That's not true. Like, I mean, I did two moderations from the AMP stage, and one of the folks that I interviewed, really interesting thoughts, was the president of the American Enterprise Institute, which is a center-right organization, and he was arguing that $15 an hour minimum wage is not necessary, that it's too much of a burden on on businesses. That is not a liberal idea, I would say. And it was an excellent conversation, right? So the part where I think I have something to offer in this area, I'm trained in and have long practiced the techniques to bring people who disagree to come together and have a deep and meaningful dialogue. And that is where I think Chautauqua's promise is. So if we look at larger society, we are in this mode right now. We look for, tell me your label. Are you a Republican or a Democrat? Are you a conservative or are you a liberal? And once you tell me who you are, I know exactly what I want to think about you, and I don't need to listen to you. And if you start talking, I'm going to come up with every single idea to cut your idea down and not do a deep listening. That is not helping us as a community, as a country. And so what I think Chautauqua's promise is, we bring all these ideas to our grounds, right? How do we then create possibilities for more deeper engaged dialogue, where we can engage with somebody whose life experiences, whose ways of thinking are different than us, and not get stuck in the labels? That gives me hope for change, and that's what I think, what part of this plan that the institutional IDEA plan is really calling for. Create the space to change the narrative, create the space for us to do things differently.
Where were you when Major League Baseball and Major League Baseball players were negotiating? We needed you. We needed your skill set.
I have thought from time to time that I would, maybe if I was looking for a adventure maybe many years down the road in retirement, that maybe mediation might be one of those things.
I digress, but that was an important. So we are here, and we finally are getting to this point where tonight we're having an opportunity to talk a little bit about something I have in front of me called the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility IDEA Strategic Plan 2022 through 2024, which is going online tomorrow.
Tomorrow it is, yeah.
So talk to me about the genesis of this document.
Sure. So I was very intentional when I came to Chautauqua that it was really important for me to learn about the uniqueness of Chautauqua, what the challenges were, what the opportunities were. So I spent countless hours sitting on porches, going to denomination house meetings, and just being present within the Chautauqua institution community, listening to many different stakeholders about what their hopes were, what their fears were, and what was the kind of change that they envisioned happening. And then I did, after the season, I engaged a lot of staff members, the board, sometimes property owners, and then I also engaged with some community organizations outside of the gates, right? There's a very vibrant community surrounding the institution, right, in Chautauqua County. So a lot of input went into what was a jumbled mess of like hundreds of pages of notes. What comes out of that is my larger thought that if we are going to create an inclusive, diverse, equitable, and accessible space, that every single person has a role to play in it, right? So the goals are structured around what can the staff and board do, what can community groups and property owners do within Chautauqua, what can external groups do to help us, and how do we partner with mission-aligned organizations that are doing similar work. So part of it is, getting everybody to see their piece of how they can help Chautauqua get to that promised land, to that beloved community concept, as my colleague Maureen Raveno reminds me often.
Talk to me about how this plan deals with, again, long-standing and probably long outdated town and gown issues.
Sure.
You got the gate, you don't have the gate. You got Chautauqua. Most people's experiences, and again, I'm dating myself perhaps, was Friday night or Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
Or Sunday morning.
Yeah.
Go to church for free or go to a big event on a Friday, and that was it. And never the two shall meet. And I know there's been efforts in the past. How does this address that?
Sure. So part of the plan actually calls for us to really work closely with mission-aligned community organizations that are doing work that we care about, right? So if the Chautauqua's mission is to find the best in human values and in the enrichment of life, let me give you an example of how this may play out more pragmatically. So we are bringing to the grounds Matthew Desmond, who's written this amazing book called Evicted, that tells the story of what evictions look like in real life. And he looks at white communities, communities of color, he looks at landlords, he looks at the court system, writes this really complex narrative of eviction. It's not an easy fix, right? He really talks about the polarized view from the left and the right, where people believe we fix evictions by making either people responsible for their rent, or other folks saying we got to get rid of all the laws and get rid of evictions. And he says neither of those are pragmatic. We're bringing this real thought leader to the institution grounds. And what a shame would it be if we are not able to engage with Chautauqua County, Erie County, Cleveland, people who are actually doing this work on a day-to-day basis, to invite them to be part of the conversation, to hear that message, right? So part of it is, how do we find those mission-aligned organizations that are doing the work, and how do we create greater access, for them to be able to come? It has to be a greater purpose, right? So it's not to say, come to the grounds because it's beautiful. I mean, of course the grounds are beautiful. I want people to come there and get the most out of it, but that real synergy happens when we can find those places of intersection.
So, and with regards to programming, which of course most people love to see the, multicolored map, put it up on the wall
Yeah.
and see what's going on. And there are always themes that go along,
Yeah.
and 9 weeks worth of themes. How does this work into what is otherwise sort of themes that go throughout a week?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm both the Chief Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Officer, but I'm also Senior Vice President, right? So part of it is I get a chance to suggest themes, right? So I'll give you an example of that. I think that if we are to move the narrative of opposition and viewing your neighbor as your enemy, the opposite of that is friendship. So the theme that I have been championing, and I'm really hoping that Chautauquans will champion as well, this idea of friendship. So we've always talked about family as a primal structure, as a primary structure in organized life and society. We understand that, right? But think about our friendships that sustained us during COVID, what the modern friendship looks like today, how it's evolving our relationship with other human beings. That is a way to model and rethink how we build relationships in the world, right? Again, it opens that pathway to understanding the other, understanding who's somebody different than me. And so I am really excited for that. So part of my work is that. Now, do I get to sit somewhere and pick this person gets to come or not this person? I'll suggest a few names, but programming is not my responsibility, right? When people come, how they engage in dialogue, what kind of community we create around that, that very much is something, I partner with other folks. So the Department of Religion, for example, has had the Chautauqua Dialogues program, where on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, people, do sort of a peer-to-peer conversation about, okay, so we have been focusing on the theme of human rights, and we've heard 6 lectures, 3 in the morning, 3 from the religion platform. What do we make of it, right? And how do we actually not just sit and talk about it, but also figure out how we move towards some form of action? So that's the kind of, the dialogue piece, I think, is more, my contribution.
So I'm reading the introduction signed by you and somebody named Hill. And in bold part of this, it says, to create this beloved community, we will need to move past conversations of unconscious bias and take on more proactive approaches toward conscious inclusion. I assume that's your words.
Yes, yep.
Yeah, I know. And so put that in English.
So a lot of conversation right now, and particularly when you look at companies, right, they say, we'll do trainings, we'll do diversity trainings. I'm not arguing against diversity trainings, but diversity is not an ill for which one training becomes a pill that will cure all of, the challenges that we face. So a lot of emphasis is on these concepts of unconscious bias. If we only get rid of our unconscious bias, then I think the best place we're going to get to is a place of a blank slate, right? But then the next question is, how do we develop empathy and understanding for why certain communities have not come to the grounds, right? And what we can do differently to create a place of conscious inclusion, right? How we treat folks who may not look like typical Chautauquans, right? So we can easily do this around the narrative of race, but let me expand that idea, right? We can expand that to people who are non-Christian. We can expand that to LGBTQ populations. We can expand that to people with disabilities, right? So, for example, right, we see a rise, growing numbers of neurodiverse children participating in our youth and family programs, right? We can have staff, I think that's our responsibility, to have staff that are competent in serving those kids. But then what is the conversation that's happening at the family table for the rest of the youth, right? Who for the first time in their life have somebody in their youth group that may have Down syndrome or be on the autism spectrum. That's what I'm talking about, right? Everybody has a role to play. So it just can't be, you fix it and you go train the staff. Absolutely, that's part of it. But we all have a role as society evolves to find that peace, to find that connection. That's what I hope for.
In a microcosm world, where we live here in Chautauqua County, and have you found that thought process, whether it's the autistic community in Chautauqua County, the developmentally disabled folks, client base at the Resource Center, are those kind of areas where you can sort of test this out?
It's a really good question. I've only been in Chautauqua County for 10 months right now. And part of what I'm trying to do is really figure out, what are the places that are really doing incredible work. And of course, the Resource Center has come up in many different organizations. I actually had a very insightful meeting lunch with Denise
Jones.
Denise Jones, there we go, thank you. And yes, so long-term, right, if I'm talking about mission-based partnerships, right, that there may be some things, like it may be based around a speaker, it may be based around training our staff, like those are the kinds of partnerships where we absolutely have the opportunity to learn from the successes of other folks who are doing this work really well.
Off camera, we can talk about opportunities that may appear there.
Sure.
What's your sense? You're 10 months of Chautauqua County. What's your sense of this place?
I have been honestly completely blown away by the infrastructure that exists in this community for people who care for other people, right? The number of foundations, community organizations that are doing just incredible work and really thinking about how Chautauqua County is changing, right? We often talk about inclusion and diversity as a moral imperative or an ethical imperative, and those are really important. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to say there is a very strong business imperative here as well, right? So if you look at Chautauqua County demographics, in the last 30 years, on average, every single year, the population of Chautauqua County has gone down by 575 people. Every single year for 30 years. That trend, if that continues, we are in deep trouble, right? For our infrastructure, for our tax base, for employers to even want to set up more industry here, right? It's one of those things that can turn into a vicious cycle. And we heard last week in this very space, there was a conversation around refugee communities coming to Jamestown. And one of the gentlemen who spoke there said, when we are looking at, hey, if we may have to close a couple of locations and we can't find enough workers in Jamestown or in Chautauqua County, that is a strike against our Jamestown location, right? So we really have to think about the business case, right, for why diversity, equity, and inclusion is important as well. And often that, I think, is missed. So anyways, long answer. What I've really appreciated and why I was even more excited to join here, the work that so many of the organizations and foundations are doing to make this a place where everybody can thrive. Not to say that we don't have challenges. We have lots of challenges, particularly given the high poverty rate, right, in this county. But that is impressive. I've not seen that in any other place that I've lived in.
So here, Chautauqua is a physical place. I mean, it is a location. And yet Chautauqua is also a concept.
Yep.
And so as you're developing programs, you'd like to have successes, things you can refer to as a Chautauqua idea concept, which is working to, I assume, make it portable elsewhere.
Sure.
So is the goal to sort of take this and look at the physical space, Chautauqua
Sure.
area in Chautauqua County, find areas where this can be successful, and write it up, and then transport it? Is that?
Yeah.
Your sense of that?
There may be a little bit of that, right? Part of the Chautauqua Institution's larger grounds is to expand our programming beyond the 9-week summer season and to go beyond the gates, right? So we're
Right.
not just tied to the one location. So our Chautauqua Assembly offerings, creates a great avenue for us to engage with people who want to do lifelong learning, right? That's what we're good at. So part of what this could leverage into, where I see the greatest need is for a lot of businesses, they're trying to figure out, how do I support, okay, I figured out a way to have a more diverse employee base, but how do I support them? How do I make them feel included and valued? So a lot of big companies will have ERGs, employee resource groups, right? They may be groups based on race, but they may be groups on young parents, right? The challenges of being a young parent and working a 40, 50, 60-hour work. We do some incredible convening authority, so I see a lot of opportunity for Chautauqua Institution to partner with those organizations. Like, if you're engine building plant, you don't have diversity experts there, right? But we are conveners. We do the education. So particularly if you combine those ideas with an online concept, right, you can create space for lots of organizations, whether they be businesses or nonprofits, to figure out, how can I mimic, what the work that Chautauqua Institution is doing?
Many strategic plans often end up on the dustbin. And I'm sure you don't believe that's the case in this one.
Not with this one.
And though as part of a strategy to have a strategic plan win, is to have early successes. Do you have in your mind's eye one or two things where you'd say, that's something we can do in 2022 that we then can point to, which will launch us to 2023 to 2024, which is your
Yeah.
time period?
Yeah, absolutely. I would answer that in a couple of ways. So one of our biggest challenges is the accessibility of the grounds. We serve a significant portion of aging population, right? And so my hope is to bring in all the pieces to do a full audit of the physical, the technological, and the programmatic accessibility at Chautauqua. And I think a lot of this would resonate for a lot of Chautauquans, right? And so it's not just about access ramps, right? And when I mentioned the example of a young person with autism participating in our programs, that's a programmatic access piece, right? So that's one of the places that I would really focus a lot of attention. The other one piece that I'm really excited about is where Maureen and I are trying to breathe a lot of life into the Chautauqua Dialogues program. It is a hidden gem within the Chautauqua Institution community, and the more we put out, the co-leads of that program put out a call to have facilitators, just people who would volunteer to be facilitators. They don't get paid to do this. I think they've got like 80 or 90 people, something like that, right, who have signed up, right? So there's a deep desire, right, for people to engage deeper. And I feel like that's going to be a really good success. I want to change the narrative of what we're doing as a society, and I want Chautauqua to be the role model for the rest of the country.
To ensure ongoing communication, you will take the following steps. You will share this plan widely within the Chautauqua Institution community in the spring of 2022. Tonight's the night.
Yep.
Host online community engagement sessions. You'll have in-person conversations during the summer assembly. And how is that going to look? I mean, so you have in-person, that's really, will you be inviting people off the grounds to come on, or how does that work? Or is
Need to
that sort of
figure-
inside baseball? We should probably look at ourselves first before we go outside of that.
Sure, yeah. So let me answer that in a couple of ways. First, let me say this plan will be live online tomorrow morning, I believe, at chq.org/IDEA. There's a new website that we built. I want everybody to read it, critique it, and tell me how you can be a part of this, right? You don't have to love every single piece of it, but I hope that anybody who reads it finds one little piece that they say, I can help with that, or here's something that I'm excited about. So that's one piece. The second piece, to take it outside of the grounds, right? I'm going to do some Zoom sessions, right, with the Chautauqua community in the spring. I'm going to host listening sessions on the grounds, and anybody who's around is welcome. But I also think it's important to bring this work outside outside of the gates. So my reflection, and I say this with love, is I believe I may be one of only 2 people in the entire county who has a Chief Diversity Officer title, the other person being at SUNY Fredonia, right? So one of the things we found is there's a great desire for people who have good hearts and good values, but values don't always translate into action, right? So part of my hope here is that people look at this, and maybe I don't want them to think, oh, you gotta write a 12-page plan to be successful, but to borrow ideas and say, oh yeah, we could focus on training our staff, or we could set some objectives around accessibility, right? This is kind of, doing this kind of work is like learning how to run a marathon. You don't go, like nobody goes from being a baby on the floor, like you gotta learn how to crawl, then you gotta learn how to stand, then you gotta learn how to walk, and then run and sprint, and then you do a marathon, right? So part of it is how do we role model how to do this work for other communities, and that's where, you know, a few folks have selectively shared the plan with a couple of folks in the community who are trying to write their own organization's inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility goals. So part of me is to help them figure out what is the work they need to do. This plan is for Chautauqua. It's for Chautauqua by Chautauqua, but let's, you know, help you figure out how you can do the work.
One of the things you've talked about is how this can translate into enhancing Chautauqua County, especially the economics of Chautauqua County. And we all know they're having a hard time, various employers, and I'll admit I do a lot of work for the County of Chautauqua Industrial Development Agency.
Sure.
And so I see a lot of that. As to how this concept at Chautauqua, who has made a conscious effort of engaging in our county, but how that can be, in one sense, introduced to those HR officers, to the CEOs of varieties of organizations, and working with the chambers and et cetera. Is that part of your plan to say, could you ask me to be part of that? Because then you're now in the inner sanctum of people who really have a need financially, and that.
Yeah, I could, no, I would say, you know, I have my paid job, right, at the institution, and I believe it's really important that I be a good citizen of the community that I live in, right? Which is why you know, I'm showing up to events, going to organizations, and just saying, how can I be helpful?
Sure.
The way it is playing out now, I'm not boasting here, but the reason I'm telling you this is there is a deep desire to do this work, and people recognize that sometimes you need somebody with experience to help them figure out how to do this work. So in the last 2 weeks, I've been invited to serve on 3 different boards within the county, right? And I maybe have not enough capacity to do all of that, but my usual response is, I'm happy to come talk to you, right? Bring your leadership together. Let's have a conversation, right? I have gifts and talents. I do this work because I deeply believe in it. So if I can help somebody else do that too, it is fulfilling in a whole different way.
As Chautauqua is launching with this strategic plan, there's also, I'm sure, a dollar tag attached to this to make all of these, again, ideas a reality.
Sure.
And you gotta, is there financial support behind this as well?
Yeah, actually, so that maybe I didn't include this initially. Because Chautauquans believe in this work so much, there was a significant number of donors, but a small number of families that stepped forward and basically created enough funds to launch the first 2 years of this work, right? To because they thought it was important that we not only do this work, but that we get started on it right away. So that is one way I would answer that. And the second thing I would say, in the plan, we name it, like if you're going to do some work, it is going to require resources, right? So if I'm really focused on accessibility, ramps are not cheap, but we got to figure out a way to pay for them, right? So if we can create an IDEA endowment, right, that gives us a certain amount of money every year, then we're sort of building it into the system, right? So it's not a one-off. I've identified that maybe that building needs a ramp and I'll find the $30 or $40 or $50,000 to do it once, but that it's built into our system that every year we're going back and doing that kind of work. So, that's one example. And my inclination says that there's deep desire, right? And Chautauquans are very generous folks, and that they see the big picture vision, right, of how their resources can help Chautauqua become a more inclusive and accessible community.
I know you don't like to boast, but I've been asked if you would comment on how well you do at Wii Bowling.
I don't know who put you up for that. Okay, so I'll tell the story. Every Sunday we go for Sunday dinner at my in-laws, and my two little nephews are there. And the first week, because my goal is always to be the favorite uncle, and I have won that through lots of little gimmicks and tricks. I tell you, if you have a 6-year-old and you get a fake mustache for them, you are the best person in the world, right? So I had won that title, and then the first time when we did Wii Bowling with the nephews after Sunday dinner, I was the first one picked. So, I want to be with Uncle Amit. Well, over time, that sentiment has gone down because Uncle Amit's not very good at Wii Bowling. But it's fun. The whole point is, hanging out with the nephews and doing that, at home. So it's been fun.
So you don't try to beat them at every time?
Sometimes they win, sometimes I win, right? I think it's good to teach kids the value of being a generous loser from time to time. Not loser, somebody who loses. Yeah, it depends. Sometimes my competitive side comes out, but I'm mostly more of the high five person rather than the, oh, you lost person.
Yeah, you don't want to, okay. I don't know who gave me that question, but there it is. You agreed to come here tonight, and Maureen encouraged the invitation, and I was glad to extend it. As you were thinking about tonight, and this is kind of a rollout of a strategic plan and I didn't want to get too far into the weeds of it all, but what was the question that I haven't asked you? What you were thinking, gee, Greg, come at me, ask the question. And I haven't done it, and this is an opportunity because Michael Hill is watching.
I thought you would, one of the questions I was prepared for is, what's been a surprise or a challenge in the work that I'm doing. So that is one that comes up often. So when I was originally interviewing for my job, the title was Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The accessibility piece was not there in the title, but it was part of the work, but it wasn't part of the title. So that was one of the conversations I had as I was moving in here. And my first job out of college was working at the Disability Resource Center at my undergraduate institution. That was my first professional job. So throughout my career, that is a population that's been near and dear to my heart. That's work that's been near and dear to my heart. So I wanted it prominently in the title because I want to own that work. Now, I had somehow assumed, I'm like, Chautauqua, right, serves an aging population, so they probably have gotten a lot of this work fixed, right, already. But the reality is we are on historic grounds, right, and we still have a lot more work to do there, and that, if I'm being honest, I wasn't fully mentally prepared for that. There's a lot of work we have done, but there's also a lot of work we have to do, right? So even you think about the amphitheater, I'm assuming I know you've been in the old amp and that big steep incline, right? The first time when I attended an event at the amp and, saw somebody using a cane and literally like kind of pulling themselves up the railing, and I was like, wow, this is not right, right? We've invested a lot of money in creating great accessibility, I would argue, in the new amphitheater. We need to take that success and model that out throughout the rest of the grounds and through our programs and through our technology.
Because of course, you can't spell idea without accessibility, so I'm delighted you put that in there.
It was smart.
So what other questions should I be asking you? What would not everybody knows you, they're seeing you, maybe some of you for the first time, and that they would like to know about you.
What kinds of things? All right, so I get asked a lot about like my hobbies and stuff like that, right? So I'm a full human being, right? So I can talk a little bit around that. So as much as I care about this work, it's also good to nurture your mind, body, spirit. So one of the things I love doing is being a techno DJ. So when I was an undergrad, I didn't really feel like that the bar scene was my place, right? So I somehow started going to these techno clubs, and everybody there is happy, and this is before the days of YouTube. So I would just go and stand by the DJ booth, and I would see what they were doing, and I taught myself how to DJ by just literally looking at DJs, and I just loved that music. So coming out of undergrad, I had built a little bit of a following, so I was playing at clubs and stuff. And so my two options were go to grad school or go down becoming a professional DJ. The challenge with that is I love the stability of a stable paycheck. And the DJ gigs, sometimes you got a good one and once a month or maybe twice a month. But it's a passion that I've kept up with. So I have my own podcast, and when I get stressed out, I just get on my turntables and just put out some good techno music into the atmosphere. Now, not everybody enjoys it, but for me, it's more my joy and my passion.
Well, for some of us of my vintage, what's techno music?
Thumpa Thumpa. That's really, so it's fast music, it's a lot of electronic, not a lot of
Not taking the turntable and spinning, records back and forth where it made that scratchy sound.
Not so much, although in the modern DJ world, the records are gone, right? They're way too heavy. I remember going to DJ gigs, and you literally carried these 40, 50-pound crates with you, and if you happen to leave them in the car, as some of my friends did, heat will melt all your records. But now it's all electronic, and yes, there is a way to create the scratch record sound on the modern turntable.
Do you have a handle?
It's DJ Angel Wings, so and my podcast is called House Nation USA. So
You have a certain time period? Are you on a certain, or is this just a YouTube moment?
it's out on Apple Podcasts, so every couple of weeks or so, I put out a mix. And what's really fascinating to me in this podcasting world is you're not limited to your friends here. So my second highest downloads are in Canada, sometimes in France, and it shifts from time to time. So it's really a fascinating world. Like, what I do in my house, that literally an hour and a half later, somebody in Algeria is listening to it, right? And I just find that really fascinating.
I find this fascinating too, because we lived in a world of the people who behind me, my vintage, Casey Kasem, Top 40 records and all that stuff, is in the techno music. Jim's laughing. Jim, he gets it. Do you have is there such a thing as a Top 40 techno musicians?
Yeah, there is charts that come out. I don't think there's a universally accepted one, but Beatport is a company where a lot of techno producers release their music on that platform, so they have a top 100 chart. Now, this is, again, the world where a handful of DJs are making, really amazing music, but also making really amazing salaries. They have whole brands behind their music and merchandise and concerts, right? So some of the big DJs are selling out huge, 20, 30, 40,000 people stadiums multiple nights a week. So it's much more than a fringe sort of community.
Are you lobbying for one of those events at the evening? Have you talked to some of your people at Chautauqua?
I think the summer season is really busy for me, so maybe not. However, I have been roped into an event that's happening at the Chautauqua Bell. So I might, I think I might, DJ Angel Wings might show up at that.
Do you have a certain bow tie that now they could see? If I saw a picture of you on your podcast, would there be a certain, not something that you would be marketing?
Bow tie is work, Amit. So at one point, so part of doing this is, right, you got to create a spectacle on the stage, right? Something, because DJs are not like a band. You're not moving around a whole lot. So at one point I had these angel wings that I wanted to, have like a stage presence. I think I'm a little too old for that, so I've given up the wings, but I show up and I play my music and I have a good time.
Boy, this would play really well with your nieces and nephews.
The last time, actually, the nephews were over, they came over and they were like, can you show me how to do this? So we spent like 10, 15 minutes, and of course, they just wanted to scratch the record, right? That was the most fun part for them, but yeah, it's great joy. And in fact, there's a couple times where I've given, people lessons on how to do it. There's a whole math and art and science to DJing.
You're a fascinating guy.
Thank you.
This has been fantastic. One final word you want to put in about you and your Chautauqua?
I'm going to change that question. I'm going to answer it differently. So I'm going to go back about a year ago. I had said yes to this job. I only knew of Michael from my brief interactions I had had with him through the interview process and a few conversations after. And I remember distinctly when you interviewed him, and I think you brought out the best in who Michael is as a person. I think the first time I really got to know what kind of person I was going to be working with was in that interview. And then earlier today, somebody wrote to me and said, oh, Greg's great and he's going to bring out the best in you. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for creating this space. And I hope that other people felt that you were able to bring out the best in me.
Wow. Let's go fly a kite. Let's go.
Sounds great.
Thank you very much. It's been great. Fantastic.